Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Heather Moran, and I'm the CEO here at 6th and I. And whether you're here with us in person or watching virtually from home, thank you for being with us tonight and by supporting a nonprofit institution. Now, for anyone who's here for the first time, 6th and I is a center for arts, entertainment, ideas, and Jewish life. And by attending our programs, you help fuel our mission to inspire more meaningful and fulfilling lives, and we thank you for that. Before moving into tonight's program, I want to acknowledge that today is the 24th anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks that killed nearly 3,000 people, including 140 people at the Pentagon, 184 people at the Pentagon. We'd like to take a moment of silence to remember those who were killed and to show support for those who love and miss them. Thank you. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Sanjay Gupta and to congratulate him on his new book, It Doesn't Have to Hurt: Your Smart Guide to a Pain-Free Life. Dr. Gupta is a practicing neurosurgeon and CNN's Emmy Award-winning chief medical correspondent. He's the host of the CNN podcast, Chasing Life, and has written several best-selling books, including Chasing Life, Cheating Death, Monday Mornings, and Keep Sharp. In his latest book, Dr. Gupta offers pathways for relief for the 52 million people in the US who experience chronic pain every day. By sharing the latest science-backed pain relief techniques and insights from pain specialists, Dr. Gupta debunks the myth that most pain problems can only be fixed with a drug or a procedure. He argues that we have tremendous agency with how to respond. My left knee is listening. Tonight, Dr. Gupta will be in conversation with Dr. Anthony Fauci, who we are so honored to have with us this evening. Dr. Fauci's career as a public servant, scientist, and world-renowned infectious disease specialist spanned 7 presidents and was bookended by the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic. He was the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the NIH from 1984 to 2022. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his efforts to advance the understanding and treatment of HIV/AIDS. Dr. Fauci is the author of On Call, A Doctor's Journey in Public Service, and we have copies for sale tonight. Thank you again to everyone both here and at home for joining us, and please help me give Dr. Sanjay Gupta and Dr. Anthony Fauci a warm welcome to 6th and I.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Well, thank you all for that wonderful welcome to both of us. It's really a thrill for me to be here with my dear friend and colleague, Sanjay Gupta, who I've known now for, we were just talking in the back, for close to 22, 23 years. We've been to AIDS conferences together. We rode on a Black Hawk helicopter in Iraq together, among other things. So it's really a great pleasure. We're going to talk tonight about Sanjay's book, It Doesn't Have to Hurt: Your Smart Guide to a Pain-Free Life, which we just heard, breaking news here on CNN, that it is now on the New York Times bestseller list. So I think So we have a lot to discuss, Sanjay. So I want to start off by asking you a question that it struck me. By the way, I devoured this book. It is really terrific. So you guys, are going to love it.
Can I just say, first of all, I just want to thank you again for doing this. I think you probably had other things you'd rather be doing on a Thursday night, but I appreciate you spending it with us, and want to thank Sixth and I as well. This is a beautiful space. I never been here before. Last time I did something was virtual because of you.
Sorry.
But I'm really excited to be here, and I want to thank all of you for coming. And look, Wolf Blitzer's here, and that's usually a bad sign, but but it's not because of some conflict or natural disaster. Just here to support, which I really appreciate. Thank you for coming. So, and thanks. You know, this is, in medicine, we have a thing called the oral boards, and that's when someone interrogates you for an hour and determines if you have the metal. So it's kind of what I feel like right now. You know?
All right. So, when I read the book, it was really well done, and I said to myself, you know, with all the things that Sanjay has to do, we'll know his phenomenal history that he has on CNN, his podcast, Chasing Life, other books he's written. So, and not to mention doing neurosurgery. Why did you write this book?
Yeah. You know, I've been thinking about pain for a long time, Dr. Fauci. I remember when it really struck me, I was in the operating room one day, and somebody was showing me some new equipment, which was pretty remarkable equipment, and I had this high-powered microscope, and I have all this other equipment in the OR, and we were going to do an operation on a patient, and it felt very high-tech, and then I was looking at the chart, and sort of what landed the patient in the OR was pain, and the way that the patient had conveyed the pain was on a numerical scale and with a smiley, frowny face. And it was so discordant for me in that moment to think, you know, here we are in 2020s, we have all this technology, and yet when it comes to something as prevalent as pain, and it is very prevalent, by the way, 21% of the population has chronic pain, which is, takes over their whole life. Something as prevalent as that, and we don't have good biomarkers or measures. It's very hard to know how much it hurts. And it's very hard to know, I think, then as physicians, did we succeed in actually reducing that pain? Obviously, we talk to the patient, but pain is so mysterious. It is the most mysterious sensation we experience. So I was thinking about it for a long time, and then as you know, as an author, I called my publisher and said, what do you think about a book on pain? And I actually thought there would probably be a lot of books out there on pain. And it turns out there's not that many, and there hasn't been several written for a long time. So I thought, really being able to give a neurosurgeon's and investigative journalist sort of perspective on pain, interviewing people from around the world, talking to patients, and really understanding their experience. And, it sort of came together. It took about 3 years.
3 years?
Yeah.
Wow.
Just the deep dive. And, at some point when you're writing like this, it's very consuming, to the point where I think it's a bit irritating for my family because all I want to talk about is pain. And they're like, okay, Dad, enough. We get it. You're writing a book about pain. But I was dreaming about pain at some points, just all the various things, and eventually wanted to put it all in the book.
Great. So there were so many things that you said in the book, and I'd like you to amplify on just a few of them. But I was struck by the sentence, which is the first sentence in the last chapter on savor moments and memories. And you said, which I think is the theme of the book. I want to see if you agree with that. But you say, quote, much of what you've read so far has explored how pain is manufactured in the body, where it is processed in the brain, and what you can do about it. And the whole theme throughout the book is something that I, as a physician for now 60 years, have never really looked at pain that way. It was always, the pain is in your leg or the pain is in your side, and not thinking about the idea of what you've so eloquently articulated in the book is that relationship between the organ itself and how the brain processes that.
Yeah.
And that is just a novel concept, which a little bit I'm embarrassed about, that I didn't really appreciate that, and I'll bet if I ask many of my physician colleagues, they would be saying the same thing. So you want to just comment about that, and then we'll take it from there?
I think this was the most fascinating thing for me as well. And I think, certainly as a neuroscientist, we've thought about pain from a brain perspective quite a bit. But this idea that pain does not exist unless the brain decides it exists, it's a bit of a hard thing to get your head around, if you will. But it is the case. And so just from a pathophysiology or from a mechanism standpoint, you injure your ankle, you twist your ankle or something, and there are these what are called nociceptors, pain receptors, which are sending signals, and this all happens, in the blink of an eye, sends signals to your spinal cord, and then the spinal cord sends the signals to your brain. And your brain is trying to then determine what this is. But the brain is doing all kinds of things in addition to evaluating those nociceptors. It's looking at your previous memories. Have you had this sort of injury before? If so, what did that feel like? But also seemingly arbitrary things, like what's the weather like outside? Did you have a good meal? Did you have a good tough talk with your mom? All these things that you would think have nothing to do with the fact that you just turned your ankle could be influencing how much pain you feel in the moment. So yes, it is the pain receptors, but that the brain is deciding. And what is really fascinating is that for the brain, it's kind of like looking at a social media feed, and then it sees something that looks incendiary there, and it's trying to determine, is that real or is that not real? That particular tweet or Instagram post or whatever. And if so, how do I react to it? And this is all happening, again, in nanoseconds, but the brain is deciding. So much so that the brain sometimes can get it wrong. Sometimes you may twist your ankle and feel pain in your knee or somewhere else instead, or something known as complex regional pain syndrome, where you've had a knee operation, but now all your pain is in your foot, for example. Like, why would that happen? Because the brain's not quite getting it right. Or the brain can actually even manufacture pain in parts of the body.
Phantom pain, yeah.
Phantom pain. Right. So how does that work? The limb doesn't even exist anymore, and yet the brain is generating pain there. Point being that the brain is the ultimate regulator of pain. And that presents opportunities, I think, in terms of how we think about pain. Presents opportunities that we haven't given enough attention to, I think, over the last certainly 25 years or so. So the brain decides if you have pain, and the brain can create pain as well. There was I don't know if you've seen this one experiment, but they have the fake hand experiment. So you got your hands out, then you put one hand behind, and they basically put a dummy hand over here. But they basically teach this dummy hand and your real hand to basically be correlated. So you'll see them rubbing the thing, and then they're rubbing your actual hand behind it. And all of a sudden, that dummy hand becomes your hand. And as they're doing this, you're starting to really identify with this hand that is not your hand. Then they bring a hammer and they just smash it.
And you feel
oh my, and you feel pain.
Yeah.
It is incredible, really, this relationship between the brain and pain. And again, I think part of the reason, I just find it interesting, which is why I wrote about it so much, but I think it's really where much of the future is going with regard to pain care. It's not that some of the pain meds and stuff that we will talk about, I'm sure, are going away, but the idea that if you don't address the brain, you're probably not fully addressing the pain.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one more question, but then I want to get back to that, because listening to you and reading your book carefully and trying to absorb it as best as I can, it just seems to me that with all of the mysteries of the brain and the Brain Initiative and how we can now have people who are paralyzed just think things and we have movement or expression of verbal articulation, is that's the future of brain science, what you're talking about, the dissociation of the brain. So the next question is one that, again, I loved the way you expressed it. In your introduction to the book, you ask, what is the difference between acute and chronic pain. And it was a great sentence. You said acute pain is straightforward response to an injury. It grabs our attention and teaches us a lesson about avoiding pain. So there's a good reason for acute pain. Then you said that the brain misfires in the sense of that the CNS is chronic pain serves no real useful purpose except to hurt. So can you flesh out a bit?
Yeah.
You call it a stubborn mystery in the book.
It is a stubborn mystery, although I think even in the process of writing the book over 3 years, and one of the great joys of writing a book is I get to talk to everybody and talk to scientists, but also philosophers, memory experts, people who you wouldn't think necessarily have a relationship to pain, but because it is such a mysterious sensation, it really crosses all these disciplines. But I think what you said is right. So acute pain is pain in the moment, and it is very evolutionarily understandable. We feel pain so that we can learn lessons. That pan is hot, that tiger has sharp teeth, whatever it might be, and you learn to avoid these things. It's very instructive, and it's primarily for survival. If you get right down to it, even though we've evolved a lot, obviously, as a species, that's what that acute pain existed for. I think what was bewildering to people was when that pain came and stayed. How long should pain last after you touch a hot pan or something like that? There's not a great answer for that, and it's going to be different person to person. And it's even going to be different within that same person day to day. So you bang your thumb with the hammer on a Tuesday, your pain experience could be very different than if you did the exact same thing on a Wednesday, going back to those sort of arbitrary factors. Chronic pain, strictly defined, is when the pain lasts at least 3 months. For some people, it lasts decades, but at least 3 months or 6 months every other day. That is sort of what chronic pain is. But why? That was the stubborn mystery. And I think that there's a lot of neuroscientists who I talk to who will say, look, this could be like one of those glitches of the central nervous system, where the brain is not quite getting it right, or it's replaying a memory loop over and over again. So it's replaying that acute pain experience over and over again. And that's a glitch, they're saying. In fact, at Mayo, they made this comment to me that people who have extraordinarily good memory are more likely to have chronic pain. It's like they remember everything well, including pain. And so the pain just persists. But I think there is emerging evidence, Dr. Fauci, that maybe chronic pain does serve some purpose, one that we just haven't quite figured out yet. For example, maybe some of you have heard of the book, The Body Keeps the Score. Bessel van der Kolk, and I had a long conversation with him about this. But his basic thesis was that there's things that happen in our lives that may not be an obvious source of pain. Could be adverse childhood experiences. It could be a history of depression, anxiety, poor sleep, things like that can lead to physical pain. There's been a disentanglement of this. But if you look at, for example, social isolation, and you say, what happens in the brain of someone who's isolated, who's socially isolated? And you'll find that some of the same areas in the brain light up with pain, which is kind of extraordinary. Could it physically hurt to be socially isolated? The brain sometimes has a hard time distinguishing. And this might be the point of the chronic pain argument that Bessel and other people make, is that, hey, look, you may not know what's going on. You may not put together an adverse childhood experience, for example, with your hip pain that you have now, but the body keeps the score. Yeah. That was his sort of point. And I think, I'm sure we're going to talk about this, but again, I talk about these things not in the abstract because I think they represent opportunities then. Once you understand that hip pain, I've done scans on the hip or the lower back, MRIs and all this sort of stuff, and it looks fine. There's no problem there. That's 90% of the patients who come into my office as a neurosurgeon. There is no operative sort of problem. And yet there's no denying the patient also has pain, right, and chronic pain at that. And why is that? It's worth, I think, the deeper exploration.
Right. Okay. in the chapter, Tell Me About Your Pain, I was struck by one of the things that you said. And I'll tell you why it struck me, because as a physician and what I do, I have sort of a parallel to that. You said 30% of young adults experience chronic pain. And one of the most consistent factors is simply being female. Now, right away, that's a big red flag there. And the reason I say that is that, you know, we're still struggling with long COVID and what the potential or real pathophysiological mechanisms of long COVID are. But when you look at the cohorts of people who are experiencing long COVID, it heavily weights to women, quite heavily, significantly. And that is unfortunate, because then people say, well, they're more hysterical, which is crazy nonsense. The fact is, if you look at the physiology of women, if there's any bit of inflammation that's involved persistently in long COVID, that women have a more hyperactive immune response, which is the reason why autoinflammatory diseases, lupus, very heavily weighed towards women, other types of autoinflammatory disease. So it may be that the mechanism of long COVID is some sort of a propensity to be hypersensitive to inflammation. That was my colleagues, our field. What do you think explains why it's more prevalent in women, in young women?
They're not sure, I mean, is the most honest answer, because a lot of people have looked into this. They had a better answer when I started exploring this in terms of women who were entering menopause, because when you looked at the correlation between estrogen levels and inflammation, that was pretty clear. As estrogen levels went down, inflammation went up. And by the way, if you replace hormones, hormone replacement therapy, you did do a pretty reasonable job at bringing inflammation down. So that part of it made sense to me. Why for younger women the same was true is just, I don't think it's clear. What I think is important to note, though, is that just like with Alzheimer's disease, which affects 2/3 of the population is going to be women, it's similar when it comes to chronic pain. And you know, I think this is really worth exploring, but I think ironically, women are wildly underrepresented in all these studies. And if you talk to investigators, they'll say, look, we need to have consistent results, and hormonal fluctuations can sometimes throw off results. That's the answer they give. But if you look at the data, even on pain, on Alzheimer's, many other things, probably even long COVID to some extent, it's primarily going to be men. So you're not getting great data on women, and you're not getting great data on children either. So like dosing pain medications for children, it's often based, they do it just on body weight, but one thing I remember, you know, in medical school was children are not just small adults. You can't treat them that way. They have an entire different physiology, but we just don't have data. So despite the fact that you have certain populations, like women in this case, that are overrepresented when it comes to pain,
right,
they're underrepresented when it comes to actually studying it, which is really unfortunate. And something I spent a lot of time talking about in this book, because that has to change.
Right.
You can develop some wonderful therapeutics for this, but they maybe need to be dosed differently or be modified in some way chemically in order for them to work as well on other populations. So
right,
hopefully we're going to get to the point, but I really wanted to beat the drum on this point in the book.
Right. You know, again, the book is rich in these kinds of statements. And another one that I discussed actually with my wife, Christine, and she helped me to appreciate that, because she and I were a doctor-nurse combination during some of the most difficult times in the early years of HIV, which is where I met Christine.
It's a great story of how you met. Will you tell the audience real quick? Just to tell, like, it's such a good story. Come on.
Oh, we got to be quick. I don't want to take it away from you.
No, it's good. It's the opposite of pain.
Yeah. So Christine was a nurse, a clinical nurse specialist on the ward in the early years of HIV, and I was an attending at the time. But we had a patient in there who was on another protocol of mine who was a Brazilian senator who didn't speak any English, only Portuguese. Christine had just come back from a couple of years in Brazil with Project Hope, and she spoke fluent Portuguese. So we came into a room, and he wanted to go out of the hospital, but he had some ulcers on his leg, but he just needed to get out of the hospital. So she said, well, we'd have to get the attending physician to let you out of the hospital. So they found me, and I was the attending physician. I had just come back from a trip to China, and I was standing by the bedside. So I needed a translation. So I said, you know, we'll discharge you, but it's very clear you still need care of the ulcers on your leg. You had a vasculitis, and you've got to raise your leg. You've got to do this. You've got to, you know, stay off your feet, keep it elevated, and rest. Otherwise, I can't discharge you. Do you understand that? So I told Christine to translate it. Meanwhile, Christine had been very good friends with this patient. She used to cook meals for him when he was in the hospital when I wasn't there. So she said in her good clinical judgment that, you know, I think it's better for the patient to go home because in the hospital, he's just not going to do well. So I said, well, translate it. So he goes in Portuguese, turns to Chris, and I said, well, what did he say? And Chris said, he said to her, there's no way that I'm going to stay in bed. I'm going to go to the beach, I'm going to drink cachaças, and that's it. So Chris said to me with a very straight face, he said he's going to do exactly as you said. So then a week or so later, I was struck by all the things about her that I love, grew to love. So a few days later, I said, can I see you in my office? And she said, oh my God, he found out that I lied. So she came into the office, she sat down very nervously, and I said, would you like to go to dinner? And that's how it started. That's pretty good. Anyway, sorry to take that minute and a half from Sanjay, but Sanjay, there was one thing in here that Chris helped me with because she knows patients very well during her years as a nurse. She's now a bioethicist, but she spent many years as a nurse. And in your book, you say it sort of indirectly, but you say it clearly, that the patient's role sometimes, often, with pain is passive, is I have pain, you're going to give me something for the pain. The physician's role, and here's where I feel humbled by reading it and why I'm going to tell all my colleagues to read this book, my physician colleagues, in addition to the general public, is that relationship between the patient doesn't have an active role in modifying and ameliorating the way they experience pain. And it's the patient is passive. I have pain. The doctor comes, writes whatever it is that you write for pain, and it isn't that interaction of the physician helping the patient to deal with what you've been speaking about for the past several minutes. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because it actually, I have to tell you honestly, it humbled me to say, oh my goodness, I haven't been doing it completely correctly. It's not that I've been doing anything bad that's medically bad, but I wasn't utilizing that interaction of the patient taking an active, non-pharmacological role in adjusting to their pain.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's most physicians. And I think when it comes to pain, I think it's often treated like a lot of other conditions, very didactic by the physicians. Here's the problem, we're going to treat it, usually a monotherapy, a single drug type therapy. The idea, the way this came about, Dr. Fauci, was I wanted to go spend time with pain doctors because pain doctors are really hard to get in to see. And I wanted to understand what was sort of the secret sauce, if you will. Like, what are they doing differently than other doctors? Because obviously we have access to the same medications and things like that. So what does the pain doctor really do? They obviously know a lot more about pain, so I don't want to minimize that, but just in general. And one could say that they spend more time with patients. That is true, but I think it's more exactly what you just referenced. The idea of thinking of the patient as an active participant, an active investigator into their pain care as opposed to a passive participant. And that involves really drilling down on what exactly is the pain. And when I say drilling down, it sometimes would mean, can you draw your pain? Can you outline it here, or draw it, or really describe it? Well, it's cold and then it has hot spots in the middle of it. All those types of things. Really understanding what makes it better or what makes it worse. Patient comes in with headaches. If those headaches are worse in the morning, that is likely to be a sinus-related problem, because when you're lying flat on your back all night, your sinuses may start to accumulate fluid. If your headaches are worse at night, it's probably more of a tension headache. And yet for many people, a headache is a headache, and they're treated the same way with anti-inflammatories, Tylenol. One could require a totally different treatment. That's a small example of this idea when you start to actually spend time with the patient and allow the patient to really tell their story. So when does it get better? When does it get worse? How did it begin? Drawing it, really trying to describe it the best that they can. Many of these pain doctors, as soon as the appointment is made, they'll ask these patients to keep a pain journal. Are there certain foods that reliably exacerbate your pain? Are there other things in your life that are associated with this? I found that to be really fascinating, and I think the best pain doctors were the ones who really then looked at all that information and oftentimes came up with pretty insightful sort of strategies. There's this one woman who I talk about in the book who, it's incredible. She had migraine headaches for 20 years, and every day. And she's married, she has 2 children, and you forget how much pain hijacks your whole life. She said to me, and I'm a father of 3 daughters, that she never got to enjoy her kids growing up because she was always in a dark room, trying to alleviate her headache. And she was functional enough. She went to school, went to law school and stuff, but everything, the type of colleague she was, the type of wife she was, the type of mother she was, were all dramatically affected by these headaches. And she was getting good care, and they were trying all these different things. Eventually, she goes to one of these pain doctors, a guy named Joel Saper. And he's sort of this renowned headache doctor. And she sort of shows up, not really hoping or optimistic, I should say, that she's going to get relief. But he does this exercise that I'm talking about, the pain journal, and really going through her history. And it turns out that when she was in high school, and she's in her 40s now, when she was in high school, she had a fall when she was a flyer as a cheerleader. She'd fallen out of her routine. And wasn't that big a deal. She hurt her neck. Someone sort of landed on her neck, but didn't slow her down. 10 years later is when she started to develop the migraines. So she was in her late 20s at this point, and now she's in her 40s seeing him, and he drills down on this high school experience. This high school thing, no one thought that had anything to do with these migraines. Ends up getting neck physical therapy and does what's called an epidural, cervical epidural shot, a spinal block essentially. And her headaches are gone. Gone. And she had been through 7 generations of migraine medication, she told me, all these various things. But the idea all of a sudden of, hey, the neck really seems to be the origin here. Can we target the neck to try and address the head, which is what he was doing. And in this case, it worked. And a lot of that came about just because she was an active investigator right alongside him with this journey. So I think, the message, with regard to the active investigator part is you know a lot. The patient knows a lot. William Osler, who is one of the fathers of medicine in this country, William Osler once said, listen to the patient. Quite often they're telling you the diagnosis. And I think that's what I really took away from that. If you spend that time and review the journal and everything, oftentimes you're going to come up with a pretty good answer.
Yeah. Actually, you mentioned later in the book, you talk about finding the right fit and read the questions you had. And if I look at this page here, it was just a list of questions to ask your physician, which is really great.
I mean, it's a unidirectional relationship sometimes. You go into the doctor's office and you're sort of getting talked at, and I've been a patient as well as a physician, so I kind of know that. But the idea to really be able to direct that conversation, have your questions ready, but also, detailed answers to the questions you're likely to get asked.
Yeah. I was just thinking as you were describing something that happened years ago that leads to pain now. Sanjay describes in the book when he was a child getting impaled on a fence. So
yes.
What pain do you have now for that? Why don't you tell the audience about that?
I'm good today, but that was I'll just tell you quickly. I was 12 years old, and it was a perfectly lovely day. And I was well fed, and it was, I was running through the neighborhood, trying to run back home, and I was running late, apparently. And so I decided to sort of vault myself over this fence that I normally would go around. And I misjudged it. And so when I vaulted myself over, it was a spiked fence. It had these big spikes on top. And I landed on the spike, and it went right through me. Yeah, I know. Front to back. So, and it was also a situation where it was high enough that I essentially was pinned. I couldn't put my feet on the ground to sort of hoist myself off of this thing. So I was lying there impaled on this fence, and which was really a very crazy experience, obviously. And I can't help but think I had a lot of pain initially, but also had a lot of embarrassment at the whole thing. Like, was I to be found like this? But what was so interesting about that for me is that it obviously hurt when I got impaled, but it did not actually feel like what I think most people might think it would feel like. It didn't feel like a hot poker suddenly going through me. It felt more like someone had slapped my back really, really hard. And then after a while, and I was there for several minutes, and I'll tell you what happened, but I was there for several minutes, and at some point, it really did not hurt that much. To the point where I actually reached behind to say, is this thing still in me? Like, it doesn't feel like it anymore. And I think I didn't know this at the time, I was 12, but it was my first experience with what we now call the endogenous opioid system. Your body is continuously making opioids. And when you have an injury like this, your body can respond quickly by making these opioids. And sometimes if it responds really well, and that can be, again, dependent on the weather outside, were you well fed, all this sort of stuff, it can almost feel euphoric for a period of time. So you've just injured yourself badly, and yet, you see people kind of laughing about it. And it's like their endogenous opioids just sweep over their body, they mitigate their pain, they improve their mood, and they also do something else really interesting. Your endogenous opioids, they suppress your memory. So it's like they don't want you to remember this experience that much. And I joke around, well, not joke, but I talk about it in the book that were it not for the endogenous opioid system, probably no woman would ever have more than one child. But you talk to women, and I have 3, and I talk to my wife about this, like, how much do you really remember about that part of it, the pain part of it,
Yeah.
It's not so much that I won't do it again and again in our case. So, but if I can just make this point, though, because I think it's so interesting, so much of what we have in medicine takes inspiration from our own human bodies. So the whole opioid crisis situation, these drugs, they were modeled after our own system. We have these things called endorphins in our body. Endorphins are endo, which is body, and phin, morphine. So it's our own body's morphine. And we created these molecules to treat people for pain based on that. But what I think people didn't realize is that there were some significant differences in how your endogenous opioids behave versus exogenous or outside opioids. Well, both will address pain. That is true, and that was the purpose. But your endogenous opioids do 2 other things pretty well. One is they improve your mood. They improve your mood. Exogenous opioids, people who become opioid addicts, they will tell you, I'm not taking this to get high anymore. I'm taking this to not feel terrible. I'm taking this to try and achieve some sense of normalcy. But your endogenous opioids, that runner's high or whatever, that sort of, that really good feeling, that's your endogenous opioids. And then again, this notion of memory. So decreases pain, decreases memory, and improves mood. Exogenous opioids decrease pain, decrease mood, and actually amplify memory. Okay? So when a lot of these people who talk about opioids say, look, part of the issue with opioids is that they're more likely to result in chronic pain, it's because they're forcing you to remember this more than if it was just your own endogenous opioids working.
Right.
And I think that the most important thing about these is that your opioids that you take, that you have inside your body, can turn on and off very quickly. Unlike opioids that you take as a pill, which may last for hours and you don't feel well. So anyways, I'm impaled on this fence. And I don't know what to do, Dr. Fauci. I was like, I cannot get off this. And so this neighbor is the first guy to see me. He's a guy I know, wasn't too far from home. And he's like, oh my, like what is happening? And he says, I'm gonna go get these big bolt cutters to cut this thing off. And this sounded like a terrible idea to me, but I was 12, I didn't know what to do. And then, and by the way, I'm feeling, like I said, I'm feeling not that bad right now. I mean, I don't wanna stay there by any means, and then my mom comes out. And you know what I did when my mom came out? I started crying, which is another really interesting thing about pain. It's like, now my mom's there, and she made it real because she looked at me with this horrified look on her face. And I'm like, is it bad? But while that guy went to go get his bolt cutters, she put her hands down like this, and I put my foot on there, and I was able to foist myself off the thing. I just got off of it, which probably in retrospect wasn't the smartest thing because I didn't know if it was in my abdomen, but we just like, I'm getting off this fence. And then we rushed to the emergency room, and it wasn't that bad. It was sort of like an in-out injury. So they got a couple sutures in the back, couple sutures in the front, and then he asked me if I could stick around so he could have everybody in the department come see what happened to me to just add to my humiliation. So, sure, yeah, I'll be your N of one patient here who impaled himself today.
So now you know why he wrote the book.
That's right. Well, but I'll tell you, I didn't really think about that story that much over the years.
Yeah.
It wasn't a story that I really shared. Part of it, I think, goes back to the embarrassment. But I think part of it as well is that I think my endogenous opioids did a really good job of suppressing the worst memory of it. Of course, I know what happened, but I don't look back on it as a particularly traumatic experience. And it hasn't affected me. I don't have any chronic pain as a result of it.
Again, there's so many. Read the book, you'll have the same impression that I had about it. You'd want to ask him a lot more questions, so I'm going to but he does a magnificent job.
Thank you.
We don't have unlimited time, but I was really struck by your description of the two Johannas, the people that you did the discectomies on. I mean, that was an amazing story, and I think it really just synthesizes everything you're talking about. Can you just briefly tell them about that? It was
a really interesting day. So I was operating, and on that particular day that I was operating, I had two patients where I was doing the same exact operation, which was a lumbar discectomy. So making a small incision, vertical incision in the back, and basically finding a herniated disc and removing that disc, which is pushing on a nerve root. Pretty commonly done operation, something that I do a fair amount of. It was just so interesting that particular day I had two patients who were the same age, both women, and kind of similar, like in terms of their medical history and things like that. And they both had the same name, which was confusing for everybody because we wanted to make sure we were operating the right patient and all that sort of stuff. Both named Joanna. And the operations, they went fine. Like there was nothing that I would have described as remarkable during either of the operations. And the next morning I'm making rounds, and I go to see Joanna number one, and she's already sitting up in bed, and she's put on her lipstick, which is always a good sign, like she's ready to go meet a friend for lunch, She's doing great. And so she wants to get out of the hospital as quickly as possible. She's walked the halls and everything. I go to see Joanna too, and I right away knew there was a problem because the room was totally dark, and she was still slumped in bed, and there was also what's called a morphine pump, which is a patient-controlled anesthetic pump where you can push a button and administer your own dose of morphine, which I hardly ever use. And yet someone overnight had given it to her on call. And she was in terrible pain. She was just unable to even speak, just grimacing. And it just really struck me, like, what first thing you think, I think, as a surgeon is, did I do something wrong?
Right. I was just going to.
Yes. Yeah. Did I? And so you, oh my God, what was going on here? And so I talked to everyone else who had been in the operating room with me. Did I miss something? Did something happen after the operation? Anything? And there was really nothing that was of note there. And you just came to realize, I think, in that moment, in some ways, so many of the points of this book was that, people can have the exact same experience, kind of like I talked about with you, banging your thumb with a hammer. Not only is it variable person to person, Joanna 1's pain experience was totally different than Joanna 2's pain experience. But it could even be different within the same person. Joanna 1 may have had a totally different pain experience if we did her operation a week later for some reason. That's wild, Dr. Fauci. How do you, so what I would love to be able to know is who is going to respond how ahead of time. Like if I would have known Joanna 2 would have responded that way, maybe we would have done some other things ahead of time. As I found out, she had a significant history of depression. She had a herniated disc. That's my primary obligation, right? And yet, with so many pains, they always come with baggage attached. And it's a two-way relationship. The pain can make the baggage, in this case her depression, worse, and the depression can make the pain worse. It's bi-directional. And I think we're obligated, really, to at least ask the question and maybe do something about it before you do the operation, or at least be aware of it, because it's going to very much affect the outcome of how they do. So it was a very instructive story for me.
Yeah. No, it was very dramatically described in the book. It was like,
well,
whoa.
Like what happened
The
here?
first thing I thought about was knowing Sanjay's skill in the OR, he probably did a pretty good job of the operation, but they were dramatically different.
Yeah.
Anyway, so just again, I'm sorry, I'm not going to get through all of these interesting aspects of it, but another really interesting thing is that you offer 7 synergistic reset strategies, which is on page 121. I don't want to go through all of them, but they're really terrific when you talk about things like cultivate connections, sleep well, move more, mind your brain, mindfulness, and things like that. So the way you describe it, that it is feasible that a person can actually reset that, I don't know why you use the word wiring, but that interaction between the physical source of the pain and the mind. You just don't accept that there's nothing you can do about it.
That's
you
right.
can reset that. And
yes, absolutely. I think I became very convinced of that, again, talking to all these pain docs and seeing tremendous sort of benefit for these patients. But I think going back to where you started the conversation about the brain, the idea that the brain is always deciding whether or not you have pain, how much pain, all of that, can even make pain. There are people who have taken that knowledge and done these extraordinary things with it. For example, there's these teams in San Francisco, Prasad Travalkar and others, who are putting these deep brain stimulators into the brain. And basically just sort of listening to the brain to see what happens when the brain is in pain. So it's brain surgery. They have stimulators placed into the brain, and then when the person has pain, they're recording it somehow with a button. And they can do this for weeks and months. And they're just listening to the brain. Mm-hmm. And to give context, there's 84 billion neurons in the brain, and there's about the same number of stars in the sky. So imagine just basically throwing these telescopes up at the sky and just sort of seeing what you see. And every time the guy has pain, there's a star over there that seems to be activating. Let's see if that star has anything that might be useful. Next time the guy, we see some glowing in that star, let's stimulate it and see what happens. And what they found, and I'll get back to the reset, but what they found was that there were these areas that were very predictable in the brain that would change when someone was about to have pain before they were even aware of it.
Wow.
Before it reached conscious awareness. So little energy transfer in the brain over here. They could measure the strength of that energy transfer. They could start to predict it because you'd see little energy transfers around that, and then they could interrupt it. So think about that. Guy has pain, and the patients who were in this trial were the worst off. They just had no relief. They put these stimulators in. They were able to find areas that were reliably changing whenever the person had pain, and they would see the change start to happen, and then they would measure it. So they could actually measure how bad it was. The holy grail of pain. How bad is your pain? They could measure it in the brain. And then they would stimulate and interrupt the pain signal. So they found it, they measured it, they predicted it,
Wow.
and they interrupted it.
Wow.
That was all in the brain. So the point being, though, we are obviously not going to do brain surgery for all these patients who have chronic pain. That's not the answer. But we do know that changing the brain, as they were doing with these stimulators, is quite possible in non-invasive ways, including things like meditation, which sounds almost silly in the context of what I just, that's so low tech compared to deep brain stimulation. And yet studies have shown people who are regular meditators reliably thicken certain areas of the brain, measurably, objectively. So if you could start to meditate in a way, which these guys are doing at the study in San Diego, you could change parts of the brain that are associated with your chronic pain. So it's not just giving you benefit in the moment, which a lot of people with meditation get, but it could actually give you longer-term benefit as well. All pain is in the brain, and you can change that in many ways.
So, again, I want to be mindful of the time because I want to get to some questions.
I could talk a lot, by the way, in case
No,
you didn't know.
I'm
so into this book, so.
I'm into this book too. I was actually struck by, when you all read the book, for those of you who haven't, that there's two books here, and they synergize with each other in a wonderful way. There's part one, which is a very eloquent but crystal clear delineation of the physiological and anatomic mechanisms that Sanjay is talking about. And then the second part of the book is something that, as I mentioned, synergizes with the first part of the book. But if you look at the chapters it could have nothing to do with pain. It just tells you about how to be healthy. So if you want to know how to be healthy again, listen to him. Okay, so, I mean, if you look at it, chapter 13, more and more, the multifaceted benefits of exercise. Chapter 14, sleep well. Chapter 15, eat well, talking about oxidative stress enhances pain and the antioxidative stress of antioxidative foods, which actually alleviate stress. Cultivate connections. Our good friend Vivek Murthy and all the work that he's done about connections and loneliness, which you bring up very well, completely independent from the things he's talking about, but it just beautifully synergizes with that. And then at the end, where you say, savor moments and memories, carpe diem quam minimum credula postera. I took a lot of Latin.
Did a Latin major, right? I could just write it. I couldn't say it.
Seize the day, trusting as little as possible in the next one, which is really fantastic. But tell me a little bit about what you put into and your thoughts about those second part chapters, which are so beautifully scientifically based, evidence-based ways to stay healthy.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of evidence around things that we can do in terms of lifestyle for pain. And again, I think it gets short shrift because we became a very monotherapy culture for so long. And frankly, opioids was the monotherapy for a long time. And as a result of that, I think we become conditioned to this idea that if I have any pain, that I must take a medication, be it an opioid or something else, or I must have a procedure. And this is particularly problematic in the United States. I mean, at one point, as you know, we were taking 80 to 90% of the world's opioids in this country. And we are 4.6% of the world's population. In 2023, we did 1.2 million spinal operations. And to give context, in the UK, they did 50,000, and they're a quarter our size, but even if you do the math, we do way more, 6 to 10 times as much as the next countries in terms of, we don't like pain, and we want really quick fixes for it, especially in the United States. By the way, had a colonoscopy a couple years ago, had propofol, which most people do. Not in Japan. Hardly anyone gets propofol or any sedation in Japan. 6% of the population in Finland will get that. We just expect it here in the United States. And by the way, again, I had the propofol, so I'm not like trying to preach here, but I'm just saying. So did I. But I'm just saying that some things just become custom, and as a result, things get lost, including the lifestyle changes. And because we just don't think a lifestyle change is going to offer the same benefit as a pill. And yet, there's plenty of good evidence, much of what I spent the last 3 years really digging into that provides that. I think one of the big sort of things that was in common here was just the role of inflammation overall. And again, with inflammation, I think a lot of people think of it as a 4-letter word. You don't want that. And yet you come to find out, which I can talk about, but inflammation can play a really important role here. So really understanding how to control the inflammation, not to simply get rid of the inflammation. I'll just share with you, one of the questions I had was, who is most likely to develop chronic pain? Just take a population of people. Can I sort of figure out? And one of the studies that came out of this showed that people who actually had the lowest levels of inflammation at the time of injury were the most likely to have chronic pain. Counterintuitive.
Right.
Because you think more inflammation, bad. And yet the lowest levels of inflammation were most associated with chronic pain. This is really important because what do we do if you sprain your ankle? You're told to rice it, right? Rest it, ice it, compress it, elevate it. Do anything you can to reduce blood flow and decrease inflammation. Makes total sense, except for the fact that low levels of inflammation are more associated with chronic pain. So the acronym for a lot of people in this world has gone from rice
to meat.
To meat, exactly, which is mobilization, exercise, analgesia, and treatment, like massage therapy. But the idea of saying, hey, don't rest that, actually move on it, that is actually probably your better bet. That lets the body do the job. That's good inflammation. If it's broken, obviously you need to get it treated. But I'm talking about things like twisted ankles and things like that. So how to sort of find that balance with inflammation through rice versus meat, but also through your diet, through your movement, through your sleep. That's what I really wanted to get at in those last chapters.
And you do a great job of that in those chapters. I just want to, in the last several minutes that we have, just entertain some questions that were sent in by the audience. Some of them have nothing to do with the book, but they're people who feel that they have an opportunity to have.
Well, you go ahead and
Sanjay
just answer
Gupta.
those.
So there's one here that says, as a freshman at Johns Hopkins aspiring to be a physician, what advice has been most useful in your journey in medicine? And do you have any advice for navigating medical education when research and science are being attacked by the federal government?
I want to hear your thoughts on this too. But let me say one thing. And oftentimes I think as docs, we get some version of the same question, which is, what would you do if this were you with regard to medical care? So if the question from this Johns Hopkins student, I will say this, that I have a daughter who's a freshman at Michigan, go Blue, and she wants to be a doctor. And I am highly encouraging of that.
Right.
I just want to say that there's a lot that is happening in our country, in our world, and I understand the trepidation with regard to the last part of the question. But when I look at it all, I think going into medicine is the best. It's the best profession in the world. You know, we get to take care of people. So I think I would tell a student like this, if he's listening or if he's here, I don't know, virtually, but you here? Oh, hi there. How you doing? What's your name? Charlie.
Charles.
Charles. Charlie or Charles?
My real name's Charles.
Okay, I'll call you Charlie. Because we're friends now. I'll call you Charlie. Charlie, I think it's the best profession in the world. I really do. What I would say is, obviously, you know, just by virtue of the fact you're here, you write the question, you have a lot of passion around this. Don't lose that. Keep in mind why you're thinking about going into medicine in the first place. And I think that's what's fueled me at a large level. I think writing early on in my career, just writing for the sake of writing scientific papers, yes, but writing about healthcare overall, that really, I think, kept me super engaged in medicine. And it also is part of the reason that I sort of bifurcated my life into doing journalism as well. I don't want to minimize what's happening in the country with regard to the second part of your question, but I'm an optimist. And I think that the scientific and public health endeavors in this country have fueled us for so long. And obviously, thanks to people like Dr. Fauci, got us through some really tough years, not just COVID, but going back to HIV/AIDS and other things, that is... It's incredibly gratifying work. It's incredibly important work, and I don't think that changes.
Yeah.
Do you have anything?
No, you said it wonderfully. If your calling is to go into medicine and science, it is amazingly gratifying. There may be negative things that get thrown in your way. They will pass. The beauty and the satisfaction and gratification you get out of either directly helping someone, preventing disease, alleviating suffering, and avoiding premature death is just an amazing feeling that's worth all of the work that goes into getting there. So please don't be discouraged.
Can I, just to follow up on Charlie's point, I mean, how worried should we be, do you think, about all these cuts that are happening? I mean, I'm not trying to be glib, because it's obviously, we could probably spend an hour talking about it, but I think that's the question I get more than anything else. You hear about people being fired, you hear about departments being cut. There are researchers that I talked to from the NIH for that book who no longer even have their jobs.
Right.
Since the time I was writing this book.
Right.
I mean,
That's a difficult thing, and it is clearly going to have a negative effect on what we're able to do in the next few years. And one of the things that I get asked all the time is that stopping and cutting off something in the flow of science, be that projects that are ongoing or people who are coming into the field, is not going to get fixed as quickly as it was broken. It's going to take probably years, if not a decade or more. And that's the thing that why I say so passionately, and why Dr. Gupta says the same thing, is that we cannot have young people like yourselves who want to get into a field where there's obviously, we can't walk away from it. You don't hear it from me, just look at what's happening, look at it in the media, what's happening. That will pass. Science will sustain. Science will sustain because it's true. Right?
So we're counting on you, Charlie.
Okay, so here's one that I think you addressed, Sanjay, and recently. You said, Colin said, I recently started a GLP-1 and have lost nearly 10% of my body weight. My blood pressure's come down, my joint pain is eased, I feel much better overall. Since the long-term effects of GLP-1s are still uncertain, what is your opinion on using a low-dose regimen to maintain a lower BMI, given the well-established long-term health benefits of weight reduction?
Have at it.
Yeah.
By the way, Melissa Dunst is here, I just want to point her out because she's the producer of the documentary that we did on GLP drugs, as well as It Doesn't Have to Hurt. So thank you, Melissa. Yeah. One thing about GLP drugs, when we did the documentary, we traveled to Denmark, we talked to the original researchers at Novo Nordisk. One thing I think is worth pointing out is that as new as these medications are for the vast majority of people here, many of them have been around for quite some time, early 2000s. And the relevance of that is that there were people who've been taking them for 20 to 25 years now. So while the data sets are small, you do have pretty good long-term data on some of these types of molecules, these types of peptides being injected into the body. And I got to tell you, we will see, I think is always the answer. Science can change, but if you look at that early data, it's very promising for decreasing blood sugar, which, they weren't even thinking about obesity when they first came out with these drugs. Obviously decreasing body weight, lowering inflammation. There will be a study that comes out of, I think, Chicago later on this year that will be a trial that I think will offer a lot of insights in the role of GLPs for dementia. So there's all these different things, and I'm not someone who really takes meds. I think, take it only if you need it type thing, so I don't want to sound like I'm proselytizing this. But I think when they first started developing these drugs, I think they were surprised that people would actually take them because you have to inject yourself. And now we know in the United States they've become these huge blockbuster drugs. As a result of that, we're going to get a lot more data. But I think the impact, not just on blood sugar and weight, but on heart disease and dementia, my guess is going to be pretty significant. Yeah. So low dose, maintenance dose. I mean, obviously talk to your doctor about that. And it's not like they don't have side effects, and they can be wildly expensive, which kind of gets back to the previous question about what's happening with regard to coverage of certain things in this country. But I think from a scientific standpoint, they look like they could be very promising long term.
I agree. So we have just 2 more minutes before we have to stop. And I want to ask you one last question, because you mentioned about the importance of the vagus nerve and all of the impact it has in so many elements of the body. So Susan asked an interesting question. Do you have insight into the new implant for chemically controlling rheumatoid arthritis symptoms and inflammation? Might there be other chemical triggers? Now, she's asking about chemical triggers, but I want to relate it to the question that there is right now a discussion about being able to put on the vagus nerve a capability of stimulating it and diminishing the inflammation associated with rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, to me, that seems incredible that you could do that, how you could stimulate the vagus nerve that would have an impact on inflammation selectively in rheumatoid arthritis in a joint. I mean, that's amazing.
It's amazing, and I think that it doesn't come out of nowhere. Like the idea of vagus nerve stimulation. So vagus nerve is a nerve that runs down, and it runs in through your chest and into your gut. Sometimes the gut feeling that people get with things is sort of being modulated by your vagus nerve. People have stimulated it for seizures, for example, in the past. But as often happens in science, they were finding that when they were stimulating the vagus nerve, people were having reduction in pain scores as well. And I think that sort of got them interested in this idea that people's pain is going down. There's got to be some mechanism behind it. And then they found that inflammation mediators were also going down, seemingly related to the vagus nerve. Interestingly, in that one study, even short of stimulation, they were finding that, it's going to sound silly again, but when people hummed, you're actually stimulating your vagus nerve when you do that. And they could actually predictably find a reduction in certain inflammatory molecules with persistent humming. I'm not suggesting that you hum all the time, but I'm just saying that this idea that these mechanisms sort of make sense works. So maybe this is a good thing to sort of end on, but we are an integrated system, our bodies. Bones, muscles, tendons, tissue, our brain, our spinal cord, all that is an integrated operating system. With a parallel operating system known as consciousness, that's different, but our integrated system, when you have certain things that are happening, you have to address the entire system. And we just haven't done a good job of that for not just the United States, but we've become a monotherapy, sort of throw a single drug at a specific problem and that's it.
Right.
And once we realize that we're integrated in this way and we can address all these problems sort of simultaneously, it makes a huge difference, I think, for patients' lives in terms of controlling their pain.
Great. Okay, so I want to take the opportunity to thank the audience for being here tonight. Thank you very much. Thank the Sixth and I people for having us. But most of all, a hearty thanks to my good friend and colleague, Sanjay Gupta.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Fauci. Thank you. Thanks for making the time.
Thank you so much to Dr. Sanjay Gupta and Fauci. Thank you for all joining us. Please stay at your seats until they've made their way backstage. So just